about the role that he played in that situation. He has blood on his hands.
Order. Order. Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you can see the desperation and hysteria setting in on the other side of the House. This is a government, they've become used to the ministerial BMWs and the leather seats in the BMWs and the ministerial houses, and they don't want to give it up. They don't want to give it up. But then they can see it slipping away from them, and as they can see that, the hysteria grows. The hysteria grows on the other side, and the desperation grows, and you can see how desperate they are simply by looking at who they are reliant upon and who they are willing to do deals with. They will do deals with anyone if it improves their chances of holding on to the ministerial BMWs and the Treasury benches. They're willing to deal with that twice convicted criminal John Banks, quite willing to take his vote. They're willing to make a minister out of somebody who leaked government information. And what did John Key say about him less than a year ago? Less than a year ago, John Key said, I want to believe him. He was talking about Peter Dunne. He says, I want to believe him, but the inquiry doesn't rule him out. And he used that as the justification at the time for accepting Peter Dunne's resignation as a minister. Simple question John Key has yet to answer. What's changed? What has changed? Because repeatedly, Peter Dunne has been given opportunities in this House to deny that he leaked the report, and he has repeatedly refused to take those opportunities. Why is that? Why is it that Peter Dunne won't stand up and say that he didn't leak the Kitteridge report? And why is it that John Key thinks it's acceptable for someone who leaked confidential government information to a journalist? Why does John Key think that that's an appropriate person to have as a minister? Simple answer, he's desperate. He desperately wants Peter Dunne's vote, he desperately wants to stay in government, and he will deal with anyone in the process. Quite happy to do a deal. There'll be a cup of tea deal coming with Colin Craig, that homophobic misogynist who I don't think has any role in this parliament. He wants to ban unisex toilets. That'll be part of the government's agenda if Colin Craig gets his way in a future national government. But John Key's quite happy to deal with him. Quite happy to deal with anyone as long as it keeps him in government. This is a government and a Prime Minister that have completely lost their moral compass. There was a time when John Key would stand up and he did rule some lines in the sand around who he would and wouldn't deal with. All out the window. All out the window now, as long as he can stay Prime Minister. Doesn't matter who he's going to deal with, as long as he can stay Prime Minister, John Key will do a deal with anyone. I listened before to one of those national members over there talking about fiscal responsibility. I was Jackie Dean, the one who wants to ban water, talking about fiscal responsibility. Well, I'll tell you what, I won't take a lecture from the national government about fiscal responsibility. This is a government that will leave as its legacy at the end of this term of Parliament the biggest debt in New Zealand's history. Let me say that again. This government have clocked up the biggest government debt in New Zealand's history. Bigger than Muldoon. At the end of 6 years of National, they will leave a debt for future generations of New Zealanders that is even bigger than the debt that Rob Muldoon managed to clock up. That will be this government's legacy to New Zealand. I won't take lectures on fiscal responsibility from that government, because we know that the last Labour government left New Zealand with a Crown debt that was net zero. None. The debt was gone. The last Labour government paid it off, and in the short space of time, those 6 years that National will have been in power, they have managed to clock up the biggest debt in New Zealand's history. They are in no position to be lecturing anyone about fiscal responsibility. And of course we know that they've got their priorities all wrong. Take education, where they want to spend more money on charter schools than they're willing to put into the state school system. That is simply wrong. They're quite happy to plough money into the ideological experiment that is state schools as part of their desperate deal with John Banks and the ACT Party, but they're not willing to put that level of funding and that level of support into our existing public school system, and that's wrong. And it is simply another example of how this government are willing to do a deal. They are that desperate to stay in government, they are willing to do a deal with anyone. No principle behind this government's decision making, no principle, no moral compass, just simply do whatever it takes to stay in government. That's the John Key mantra. Whatever it takes to stay in government, John Key's willing to do it. And of course we know he's getting his advice from Cameron Slater. From Cameron Slater. This is a guy who thinks it's okay to make fun of children dying. To make fun of children dying, and John Key rings him up all the time because he thinks he has great insights. Those were John Key's words. Thinks Cameron Slater, the guy who makes fun of dead kids, he thinks that he's got great insights that are useful for the Prime Minister. How demeaning to the office of Prime Minister. For him to be ringing up someone like Cameron Slater on a regular basis to ask for advice. He should be ashamed of himself. He should be ashamed of the type of people that he is willing to associate with. I think New Zealanders should be able to expect better from their Prime Minister than that. I think John Key should have more respect for the job and the office that he holds than that. Clearly, he doesn't. He is simply willing to do a deal with anyone as long as he remains Prime Minister. He's willing to talk to anyone as long as he remains Prime Minister. And of course, this is not a Prime Minister who has had a particularly honest relationship with the truth or a particularly robust relationship with the truth in the past. Let's not forget the Transrail shares, anybody, where John Key deliberately tried to mislead New Zealanders about the number of Transrail shares he had, or appointing his childhood friend, what's his name, Fletcher, to the head of the GCSB and then pretended he didn't know anything about it. They get memory loss over there every time they're confronted with something that's a little bit inconvenient. Or the whole Kim.com saga, John Key's sort of memory lapses, John Banks's memory lapses. Every time there's something, a scandal, John Key can't remember.
I call the honourable member Cam Calder.
An extraordinary pleasure to rise and take a call.